A man rebuilds a deck that was never broken. He measures twice, cuts once, and says nothing about what the measuring is really for. You have watched this 100 times without asking what grief looks like when it wears work gloves. I keep noticing that the project never actually needed to happen. He decides the fence is off by an inch, and an inch becomes an entire Saturday, and the Saturday becomes a pattern that repeats itself every few weeks without anyone questioning why. You start to see that the garage light stays on longer than any repair should reasonably require. I watch him sand a surface that was already smooth, and I notice he does it slower than the task demands, as if the slowness itself is the point. He replaces a faucet that worked fine, then stands there a moment longer than the job calls for, tools in hand, saying nothing. You realize he rarely announces what he is building. He simply appears in the driveway with materials already loaded. I notice that no one in the house asks him directly what is wrong, and he never volunteers it, and this silence has its own texture by now. He talks fluently about torque and grain and load-bearing weight, but never about what he felt the week his father stopped calling as often. You begin to sense that competence has become the only language he still trusts completely. This will not be explained by personality alone, because too many men of this exact age and this exact generation perform some version of the identical ritual. The pattern shows up across unrelated households, unrelated marriages, unrelated men who have never met each other, and repetition at that scale points away from individual temperament. He was taught early and without ceremony that provision counted as intimacy and that fixing something counted as feeling something. His economic entry point sat inside a shift from stable single-income households toward a labor market that demanded constant self-reinvention, and that shift trained him to treat control over physical objects as the last reliable form of control available. Technology arrived fast enough to make his early skills feel provisional, so a stud finder and a circular saw became instruments he could still master completely in a world that increasingly refused to be mastered. His working years unfolded inside a culture that rewarded stoic output and quietly punished visible emotional need, so competence became the socially accepted dialect for feelings that had no other approved vocabulary. Layered onto that is a labor identity built on being useful before being understood, which meant usefulness arrived first, and understanding was never scheduled to arrive at all. The emotional culture he inherited treated a man discussing sadness as a mild embarrassment, while a man discussing torque specifications was simply a man discussing torque specifications. Responsibility for him was defined almost entirely as output: a mowed lawn, a repaired railing, a finished basement, each one submitted as proof of continued function. None of these conditions acted alone. The economic instability fed the technological displacement, which fed the compulsive self-reliance, which fed the emotional silence, and the silence fed back into needing something physical to prove he was still capable of anything at all. By the end of this chain, there is no single adaptation mechanism holding the pattern in place. There are several mechanisms layered on top of each other, each one reinforcing the others, each one operating quietly enough that none of them ever had to be named. What this actually looks like is organized across several distinct layers, and none of them function as an isolated topic.
I noticed that what began as one observable behavior is actually happening simultaneously at 7 different depths. These layers are observable behavior, habitual patterning, identity, responsibility, relationships, meaning, and a shared blind spot operating across an entire cohort of men. Naming them does not close the question, it only specifies where the question actually lives. I watch the observable behavior first because it is the only layer that shows itself without resistance. He rebuilds the same shed twice in 3 years, each time for a reason that sounds structurally plausible and never quite is. He replaces cabinet hinges on a Tuesday night after a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and ended abruptly. You notice he narrates the project in mechanical terms only, discussing joists and brackets, never discussing what prompted the sudden urgency. I see him choose home improvement over rest, even when the house shows no functional need for repair. He treats a weekend without a project as a kind of unscheduled emptiness he seems unwilling to sit inside. You have likely seen a version of this man measure a doorway 3 times before cutting, as though precision itself were reassuring him of something unrelated to the doorway. What sustains a pattern like this for years rather than weeks is the question that naturally follows once the behavior has been seen clearly enough. The mechanism beneath it is a substitution he most likely never consciously chose. He learned somewhere far earlier than this current project that physical labor produces a feeling of resolution that emotional labor rarely guarantees. A cut board either fits or it does not, and that binary outcome offers a closure his internal life has stopped promising him. You start to recognize that he is not avoiding grief so much as translating it into a medium where he already knows how to succeed. He can finish a deck. He has no comparable confidence that he can finish a conversation about his father, his job, or his own aging body. The workshop becomes a closed system where competence is guaranteed, and grief, by contrast, is a system with no guaranteed outcome at all. A mechanism like this only earns the label mechanism once it has been repeated enough times to become load-bearing on its own. That repetition becomes its own structure because a mechanism used often enough stops behaving like a choice. He no longer decides to build something, he simply notices the itch to build and follows it, the way a habit follows itself without requiring permission. You see the frequency accelerate quietly, one project a year becoming one project a season, then nearly constant. He starts speaking about tools with more fluency than he speaks about people, and this shift happens slowly enough that no one around him marks the exact week it occurred. I notice that his family stops asking whether something is wrong because his hands staying busy has become the accepted answer to that question by default. The accumulation is not dramatic, it is administrative, a quiet transfer of emotional bandwidth into square footage. Once a substitution has been running long enough to feel automatic, the next layer becomes what it has replaced inside him. Something specific goes missing underneath all that repetition, and it rarely gets acknowledged directly.
Somewhere inside the accumulation, his capacity to sit with an unresolved feeling atrophies from disuse, the same way an unused muscle stops responding to instruction. He can rebuild an entire structure from raw lumber, yet he cannot describe in a single unforced sentence what he actually felt the day his mother's condition worsened. You notice the vocabulary gap is not laziness, it is closer to a language that was never taught because it was never considered necessary. What disappears is not the emotion itself, because the emotion is clearly still present, still animating every unnecessary project. What disappears is his access to that emotion in any form other than physical output. This concealed cost quietly creates the next limitation, because a man who cannot name a feeling also cannot signal to anyone else that the feeling exists. This layer is not the last one, because a cost this specific becomes an opening rather than an ending. Once feeling has been rerouted into labor for long enough, the labor stops being incidental and starts becoming who he understands himself to be. He does not think of himself as a grieving man. He thinks of himself as a capable one, and capability has quietly absorbed grief's entire job description. You notice that when someone compliments his work, he visibly receives it the way another person might receive being told they are loved. I see that his sense of being a good father, a good husband, or a reliable man is measured almost entirely by what he has built, repaired, or maintained recently. Ask him directly who he is, apart from what he provides and what he fixes, and the answer tends to arrive slower than it should. His identity has been quietly outsourced to a checklist of physical accomplishments because that checklist has never once failed to produce evidence of worth. This is not vanity, it is closer to a survival strategy that calcified into a personality. A self built this consistently around output eventually treats any request to slow down as a direct threat to who he believes himself to be. That threat becomes visible the moment responsibility enters the picture, because responsibility is where identity gets tested against other people's needs. He interprets being needed almost exclusively as being needed for labor. Fix this, move that, install this before the guests arrive. You notice he rarely gets asked and rarely offers to simply be present without a task attached to his presence. His sense of duty is enormous, but it has narrowed itself entirely into physical contribution, leaving emotional contribution completely unaddressed. I see him show up early to help a neighbor move furniture, yet remain unavailable in a different way when that same neighbor is visibly struggling. Responsibility for him has become a category with only one entry point, and everything outside that entry point reads to him as somebody else's job. A responsibility this narrowly defined inevitably reshapes how closeness with other people is allowed to happen at all. Closeness under these conditions becomes something delivered rather than something shared, and the difference matters enormously to the people around him. His wife may describe him as reliable and hardworking, and also, quietly, as somewhere she cannot quite reach. You notice his children remember him fixing things more clearly than they remember him asking how they felt about anything. I see him express love almost exclusively through maintenance, the car serviced, the roof patched, the gutters cleared before the season turns. What is missing is not effort, because the effort is constant and genuine and exhausting to sustain. What is missing is any consistent bridge between that effort and an actual verbal account of what he is feeling while performing it. Relationships built mostly on delivered labor eventually raise a quieter question about what any of it has been for. That question about purpose cannot be avoided once labor has occupied nearly every emotional function for this long.
He tells himself the house looks better because of him, and this is true, and it is also clearly insufficient as a complete answer. You notice he rarely frames his work in terms of meaning. He frames it almost entirely in terms of function, because function is measurable and meaning is not. I see him hesitate almost imperceptibly when asked what all the building has actually been for, beyond the obvious practical answer. Meaning, for him, has been quietly reduced to utility, and utility, however impressive, does not answer questions about mortality, regret, or unspoken loss. This substitution works for years, sometimes decades, precisely because utility keeps producing visible results that resemble progress. A man cannot keep mistaking function for meaning indefinitely without eventually noticing that something underneath the function has gone conspicuously unaddressed. That unaddressed layer is shared, and its scale is the part almost no one inside it can see clearly from the inside. An entire generation of men absorbed the same lesson at roughly the same time, in different homes, under different circumstances, arriving at the same behavioral output. You notice that this collective pattern gets misread constantly, praised as diligence, admired as work ethic, rarely diagnosed as displaced mourning. I see that the men living inside this pattern often cannot recognize it in themselves, precisely because everyone around them is doing some version of the identical thing. A blind spot at this scale does not look like absence, it looks like completely ordinary behavior, because ordinary is exactly what a shared blind spot always looks like from close range. This is the layer that explains why so many men can build entire structures with their hands and still remain in some essential way unbuilt. Nothing in these 7 layers has been operating on its own, because each one has been quietly feeding the others the entire time. The observable behavior only persists because the mechanism beneath it works. The mechanism only calcifies because it repeats often enough to accumulate. The accumulation only matters because of what it slowly displaces. The displacement only becomes structural once it reshapes identity. Identity only reveals itself fully once it is tested through responsibility. Responsibility only becomes visible in how it shapes what closeness is allowed to look like. And closeness only exposes its cost once someone finally asks what the whole arrangement has actually been for. None of these 7 layers could exist without the other 6 holding it in place. I am left with one final observation, and it does not resolve anything, because resolution was never the objective here. He remains, in this account, only a psychological pattern, not a specific person, not a story, not a case to be solved. You may recognize somewhere in this something you assumed was entirely your own private experience, unique to your own household. What that recognition suggests is that what felt personal was in fact one visible instance of a much larger structure operating quietly across an entire generation. The investigation stops precisely at that point of recognition, because recognition is where this particular inquiry was always meant to end. There is another psychological pattern sitting just beyond this one, still unexplained, still waiting for the same kind of attention. He, in that next pattern, is still only partly understood, in ways that have not yet been named here. You are invited to keep observing, not because an answer is waiting, but because the observing itself is the actual work. Thank you for staying inside this entire investigation from its first observation to its last. If one of these 7 layers felt more familiar than the others, that recognition is worth sitting with rather than resolving immediately. Subscribing and turning notifications on simply keeps this same kind of quiet, careful attention available the next time a pattern like this needs to be looked at closely.